I'm really excited to start this program today, as I'm excited that we have been able to participate and co-sponsor, and some of our faculty and graduate students participate in the block series in which Róisín Tapponi is participating and curating. So I want to just mark that. Thank you for joining us today on behalf of the Program for Middle East and North African Studies and the Block Museum of Art. We'd love to welcome today Róisín Tapponi to this virtual MENA Monday conversation, the second of the quarter, but not the last of the quarter. She's the founder of the Habibi Collective, a digital archive and curatorial platform for MENA women's filmmaking. And she's currently developing the first independent streaming service for MENA cinema, SHASHA Movies. Tapponi has directed film festivals, 4 regional film festivals, including the Independent Iraqi Film Festival. She's curated programs on MENA filmmaking and galleries, academic institutions, festivals, and cinemas. She's also working she's doing her graduate work, research as well at the same time. Tapponi is also the founder and editor-in-chief of Artwork, a new critical and e-publication for cultural workers operating the margins. She also works as a freelance journalist and written features on art and culture, and publications such as The Guardian, Frieze, ID, and Vogue. And most recently, and closest to our home at least, along with Melia Haynes-Stewart and Simran Bala, I think I see at least one of those people here, hello, hi, is one of the curators of Liberating History, Arab Feminism's a Mediated Past, which is a series of screenings and discussions and interviews and short films, of which Tapponi has curated 2 nights, and those started October 8th, they're going to end October 31st. I just wanted to alert you to the two nights of shorts that Róisín has curated. October 29th is Present Futures, and October 30th is Inherited Memory. And so today, Róisín is going to talk to us about archival practices and filmmaking and curatorial processes of archival collection and retention, and kind of the problematic status of the archive as an entity, as a whole. And so we would love to welcome Róisín to Northwestern. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak. And it's so wonderful to see so many faces. I'm not going to talk about myself anymore. My name is Róisín. I'm an Iraqi Irish curator, film programmer, archivist, whatever, everything else, based in London. Okay, so I'm just going to launch straight into it with the, I guess, kind of paradoxical fact that I really struggle with openings. I never quite know where an opening is situated or where it originated, whose story the opening belongs to, whether I'm prizing something open or whether I am opening up. So to open with the archive as a point of discussion is as open-ended as the potential of the archive itself. Barth would call this beginning an open text. And indeed, I'm opening this story of the archive by drawing attention to its very abundance of meaning. It's this idea of opening and of openness that the late and great curator Okian Wezer approaches the task of defining an archive. In his amazing exhibition catalogue, Archive Fever, which is taken from a Derridian text of the same name, he terms the archive as an open storehouse, quote, where we order, quote, chaotic fragments. His text, the catalogue, it seems to, for me, work against this teleological approach or denouement with which many theorists choose to approach the archive. The opening line of his book itself is a negation. Quote, no single definition can convey the complexities of a concept like the archive, such as are contained in Foucault's rumination of the subject. He takes this openness to his reading of works by many artists analyzing how they have appropriated, interpreted, reconfigured, and interrogated archival structures and archival materials, including work by, I can never pronounce the name, Tacitus, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Ilan Lieberman, Walid Raid, Anri Salah, Fazel Sheikh, Ayel Sylvan, Lorna Simpson, and many, many more. Like the archive itself, he shows that the artwork, the work of art is unfinished and open-ended. It's a continually, the artwork or the art object I see as well as is a continually ongoing process which asks questions rather than answering them. And to digress slightly, I think that's something that I always find quite weird when I go to an exhibition. It's almost like the work that's being presented on the walls is the finished kind of, the finished work, and the exhibition is a sort of end goal, whereas it's never kind of, I don't know, I rarely feel like I'm in an atmosphere where that exhibition poses questions, or whether that's the point of the work on show. So it's this approach that has, it's Oki Wes's approach that has resonated most deeply with how I come to terms with the concept of the archive and I guess the loose definition of the archive in relation to artwork and indeed film. Archive as an open-ended form, as a structure, a material, and a practice that through its obsession with ordering fragments lends itself quite nicely to the practice of curation. The archive is at once impermeable and evasive. And like is often the case with an unattainable person, you can become obsessed with it. With this evasiveness, with this impermeable nature, with this unattainability. So I first, my kind of beginning of my story with the archive, my relationship with the archive came from essay film. So I first discovered the archive as narrative subject in essay film. For those of you who don't know, the essay film is generally considered to be a subgenre of documentary. The word documentary containing the word document, testament to its material, textual, and testimonial roots. This really culminates, I think, in essay film, which, like the archive, is very slippery when it comes to a definition. And rather than sort of delving into hotly contested territory on what a film and what an essay film is, I'll attempt to describe what it looks like. So it's usually made by a visual artist. It's an ordering of visual and material fragments through techniques such as collaging, montaging. There's a lot of text which can feature orally, epistolary, or as haptic on the surface of the screen. I've often found that this kind of haptic text is a huge visual signifier of the genre. And by haptic in this context, I refer to Laura Marx's use of the word as a visual device that functions like the sense of touch by triggering physical memories of smell, touch, taste. Although Juliana Bruno's haptic as being a process of coming into contact with a thing also applies. This reciprocal contact between us and between cinema occurs on the surface, and it's by way of such tangible contact that we can apprehend both the art object and the space of art, turning contact into the communicative interface of a public intimacy, almost. So popular essay filmmakers include Chris Marker, Haran Faraki, Hito Sterol, Trinity Minha, and for many Arab women filmmakers, especially in the 70s and the 80s, making essay film seems to be more of a condition rather than a genre or a field which you choose to experiment with. I say this because when we think of the earliest examples of Arab women's cinema in general, You know, we think of Jabar's La Nuba, we think of Salma Bakar's Fatima 75 and Surut's Layla and the Wolves, which the last two were screened as part of Malia and Simran's Liberating History program, which they've already been shown, but if you get another chance to watch them somewhere at some point, I highly recommend. So these films are essay films. Arab women's cinema has its origins and has its beginnings and its openings in essay film, in experimental documentary. If I were to sort of speculate a reason for this, I'd say it's because the filmmaking industry, as it existed specifically up to the late 1970s, excluded women from the commercial sector. The inequalities in society in the region were and still continue to be reflected in the inequalities in the industry. Women did not have the economic, social or political backing to create narrative feature-length films. Many women made films, but they weren't called filmmakers. They were sort of marginalized to the open-ended void of visual artist. A lot of women, I think, wanted to document the truth, and this sort of distance from money and from profit and from fame that their sort of male counterparts had meant that they could have a certain distance from institutional surveillance, censorship, and representational politics. Early Arab women filmmakers strove to document the truth, which it was something that commercial backing or backing by a big Egyptian production company wouldn't have afforded them. Although women in the region now have largely penetrated the commercial sector, for better or for worse, essay films are still in full force. However, I think the reason for making these films have changed. It's not so much a condition, a social economic condition. It seems that women making essay films now have a much more historiographical agenda. And by that, I mean women don't have to make essay films now, but there is an incentive, I think, to continue what has been left unfinished. To digress, Afghani filmmaker Maryam Ghani's essay film, literally called What We Left Unfinished, takes this task quite literally. So she orders the fragments of 6 unfinished communist films in order to try and write a historiography of communist filmmaking. My favorite film of all time, Mary Germano Saba's A Feeling Greater Than Love. The essay film, it gathers the fragments of documents from pre-Civil War Lebanon to map the displaced history of Lebanese women socialist factory workers and their fight towards unionization. Shown as part of Northwestern's Liberating History program, Rania's the 3 disappearances of Suad Husni, it relies entirely on images and sound from videotapes, rare videotapes of Hosni's films produced between 1959 and 1991. Once wildly popular, but now mostly inaccessible to tell the story of her life. So for me, it seems that now, perhaps more than ever, essay films have an urgency to challenge dominant modes of historiography, of history writing, by collecting together the fragments of those who have been forcibly or otherwise forgotten. Curating and ordering these materials into a narrative tangibility, experimenting with a sort of archaic mode of storytelling. And through enacting archival work, these essay films announce that history is not finished, that we have not quite yet arrived at the present. to return to my opening thoughts on openness, or the gaping void, essay films work against the very notion of history, which factualizes the past and closes it off, even by stating that it is something past. Through gathering fragmented materials of the past, essay films reconstruct our understanding of history through drawing attention to the work that we have prematurely closed off, left unfinished, and allowed to disappear. So I'm just going to have some water quickly. I believe that this work is inherently political. Often political suppression of feminist movements, for example, and such in the region have resulted in censorship, destruction of materials, and not to mention erasure from historical accounts. Hauntology, as a term according to Jacques Derrida in his 1993 book, Spectres of Marx, he really explores this idea that the present is haunted by the ghost, whatever that may mean, of the past. Something, fragments, material fragments that are a sign that neither is present nor absent. And this is significant to my thought insofar that the inherited memories, the generational memories of family photographs, the videotapes, the oral histories, oral storytelling being such a huge part of the culture in the region, and that's all of these that are featured in essay films. They're all traces, ghosts that resist being forgotten. They resist forgetting. There is a really famous line in Black Audio Film Collective, John Acumfer's essay film Handsworth Songs, that goes, there are no stories in the revolts, only the ghosts of other stories. Iranian cultural anthropologist Shahla Talebi joins the sign of a ghost, of a trace, to political revolts in her texts. Her text Ghosts of Revolution, rekindled memories of imprisonment, which I recommend. But she really draws attention to this link between political revolutions and ghosts, which I interpret as material traces. To carry on Derrida's kind of what he started. So by drawing these ghosts, traces, fragments of the material archive to the surface of the screen, we can make a powerful political statement, I think, and perhaps find even comfort or solace in knowing of the material existence of these historically powerful figures who have been suppressed for or marginalized for their radical politics. So the archive is not just a narrative subject, condition, a structure, an act of defiance. It's also a practice. It always sort of bothers me or plagues me when people ask what I do. I usually give some sort of variation, like I tried to do earlier, maybe like Rebecca did, about curator, film programmer, writer, sometimes with the additions of editor, researcher, but never really archivist. And although archiving is probably what I do most, and definitely where my passion is most present. So in 2018, I founded Habibi Collective as an open access resource and digital archive. I first learned about the concept of the archive as theory and praxis in university. And when we think of what an archive looks like, we tend to mentally image a sort of dusty library full of old leather-bound books and cryptic referencing and cataloging with these kind of weird gloves that you always have to wear. So I always kind of thought it was a bit ironic how the very meaning, the very definition of archive is built on this idea of openness and open-endedness. Yet archives are usually institutionalized and only accessible and open for a few. So I started to play with the potential of the open potential of the archive as something that, true to its nature, could be open and that utilized digital technology as a site. That's why I started cataloging my research on Instagram. Honestly, like, I have such a weird relationship with the platform, but given the sort of alt-right turn it's taking in reference to censorship, data collection, content policing, I don't think that if I started Habibi in 2020 now instead of 3 years ago, whatever, I don't know if I would have used Instagram, but at the time it was, you know, it was the right place. So I started sharing my research of hidden films or films that had become marginalized with the public sphere. I was making what was closed open. And these films were and are marginalized for their very fact of inaccessibility and their inability to be watched. I started programming films because people asked and still ask in their truckloads, where can we watch this? And that's how I started programming work. And this ongoing programming and curation of films cannot exist without this preliminary research-led archival work. I believe that programs that are curated without this work often fall short, which sadly is the condition of many online film programs and of streaming services. So film archiving as a practice for me is something that extends beyond programming. I feel like it's a whole industry and a whole institution waiting to be realized in the region. And in the West, you know, there are institutions such as the BFI, the British Film Institute, and the Anthology Film Archives in New York, who I'm working with now alongside the MoMA. And, you know, there are many prominent archivists in film history throughout history. So the person who I've found most inspiring has been Indian archivist P.K. Nair. There's an excellent film / biopic about him called Celluloid Man. But in the Arab region, I find that film archiving culture is much more decentralized and fragmented. I currently present my findings with standalone programs, as do many other cultural workers dealing with the archive in the region do. So right now, for example, I'm working on a project archiving pre-Civil War Lebanese cinema, which has kind of been a bit lost somewhere along the lines of film circulation and distribution. And I'm greatly inspired by a similar project undertaken by Joanna Hadji Thomas and Antoine Khalifi in 2012. So these programs are usually independently led, standalone, and inspired by, put on or realized by research-led artists and filmmakers, rather than film archivists, if such a profession even exists in the region. There's such a brilliant photography archival culture, I think, in the region, and particularly in Beirut, led by the Arab Image Foundation. But it really does make me wonder for the lack of institution for film archiving culture. I mean, I can speculate a reason. So the West highly favors preservation, as shown through institutions of museum, the Benjamin-infused aura surrounding objects and monuments. Whereas in the Swana region, on the other hand, I regularly get images sent to me by artist friends of 35mm reels they say from garbage heaps. It's kind of crazy. It's hard to, but also I believe it's hard to practice preservation when operating in landscapes and cultural ecospheres that face perpetual military destruction, economic and anthropogenic devastation, and also neo-colonial enterprises. How can we hold on to what is ours, you know, let alone preserve it? And how can we stop putting the writing of this history into the hands of our oppressors? As archivists, I find we're often faced with a nostalgia for what we didn't even know we had. and continually searching for fragments and dregs of our feminist histories, our queer histories, our socialist histories. You know, we desperately hold on to these findings only for them to disappear again due to our lack of film archiving culture or institution around that. So what this shows, I guess, above all, is that about the future of Arab women's cinema is how much history there is left to make. So I've been talking for just over half an hour now. I'll stop rambling. Thank you for listening. I would really like to open this up as a sort of seminar discussion with you now, because I know I didn't offer any answers, but I did pose many questions. And in the spirit of the archive, I would like to continue operating with this sort of open-ended structure. So if there's anything I've said that you'd like to explore further, or any thoughts you have on archiving an essay film, even autonomous of this talk, please use this opportunity to share. I think I'll pass on to Rebecca if she wants to sort of,
yeah. I'm here to moderate your questions, comments. You may use the chat function to identify yourself, or the hand raise function, of course, or you may send me a private chat question if you'd like to ask it anonymously, or you may, just type it yourself. So I leave it open for there. But while I wait for people to accumulate their own thoughts, maybe I can take advantage here of just asking you to a little bit about the push and pull of the materiality and simultaneous immateriality of the archive that you're working with and you're thinking about the kind of distinct, in my kind of unprofessional as a non-film critic person, a kind of a distinct objectness of archival footage, even within kind of the film essay or within the broader cinema, kind of the cinematic categories that you're working with, but at the same time marking that as, having been lost or threatened to be lost or having already been lost. And so I just was wondering how you might think about that kind of push and pull of that materiality and immateriality that you've hinted at with the kind of the question of ontology, right, as that kind of material form that comes back, but in your own practices, how you engage those kinds of questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, that sort of permeates everything, even beyond film culture. Like I guess in the 90s, there was this one kind of, lots of, especially feminists, they were sort of writing about the body, but also like there was also this question at the time being like, where is the body? And then sort of, and I guess that's where, I don't know, like vital materialism and everything kind of came in. But like, yeah, I guess it's sort of locating where is the material, especially when you're dealing with the digital, with sort of not even 35 mil reels anymore, but you're dealing with like, DCP, like digital film and digital materials. I think there is it's a constant push and pull, because there is a real difficulty to locate the online material without the sort of real physical material, which no one kind of has access to, and it's a continual sort of like you're pushing against a wall. And I think for that reason, a lot of archivists in the region, including myself, actually watch films by reading about them. And I think that's a sort of valid way of watching film in the region. For example, when I started archiving, when I started the sort of work that I do with Habibi Collective in like 2017, 2018, I wasn't actually watching these films. I was reading about them. But in that way, I did feel like I was experiencing the film. And that obviously ties into the whole thing of archive and essay film in particular, of being so textual. And so sometimes I wonder, maybe this sort of text heavy nature of Arab women's essay film and its sort of obsession with the body as a sort of way of like using text as a way to kind of ground the body and to sort of ground experience when there is no tangible material sort of presence there. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, definitely there's something to say about how text is really grounding for the lack of material, whatever, you know, we mean by that kind of presence and of bodily presence as well. That's actually really really well explored in Muna Hatoum's essay film Measures of Distance, I think from 1988, and it's like it's sort of epistolary narrative between her and her mother. So she's a Palestinian raised in Lebanon, and she studied at the Slade in UCL in London, and she, yeah, the sort of the letters with her mom appear on the haptic surface of the screen, and it's footage of her mom showering in the background, and she becomes close to the body of her mother through their letters and through this text. So I think that kind of illustrates the point I was trying to make about text being a way to bind people, bind bodies, bind experiences, material experiences together. Was that that's sort
yes,
of...
I'm grateful for your continuing to kind of think through these things with us. It's really generous of you. Thank you. I have a question, anonymous question here, asking about the process for archiving for Habibi Collective. How do you manage to source the films? You mentioned already the fact that people send you 35 millimeter canisters on, and how you organize that and so that the archive is active and constant. That's the question.
So I wish I had a sort of methodology, but I'm like chaotically organized. Well, like I'm chaotic, but I somehow get shit done. So I don't actually really have a sort of like, I wish I had spreadsheets. I wish I had, you know, kind of whatever, but I guess I identify what I'm searching for through the gaps in my knowledge. So I'll try and locate where my lack of knowledge is and then do that. And the way I kind of do that has always been through this film log, which I've kept. I've talked about this I think it really interests people. It's sort of like a kind of dated like letterbox, and it's basically this crazy Microsoft 2003 document of like all the films I've ever watched for like the past like, I don't know, like 15 years or something. Yeah, and I usually just kind of look at this crazy document and be like, where am I, what's I guess missing? As for, yeah, so when I started archiving out, it was through text, through books, through essays on the internet. Because I started like watching Arab women's essay film when I was about 12 or 13, like and that was obviously, I wasn't in education, like, well, I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere in Ireland, like, but I wasn't like not till I got to university was I kind of accessing the academic stuff. I was just accessing like articles, whatever, kind of on the internet, early days of the internet. And yeah, and then now I guess I get about 30 films sent to me a day. I get lots of things sent, so I'll kind of meet people like that, or I don't know, you just kind of build up this knowledge over time. So I'll know, I'll keep tabs on people I kind of like I'm interested in, or producers or distributors, or, you know, and I'll kind of gauge what I think I will be interested. There's this, yeah, it comes mainly through contact with people now, rather than contact through text, because I kind of feel like our theory on cinema in the region is not quite catching up with what's actually happening practically. But yeah, so it's mainly through people.
And not institutions, for example. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, sorry, what did you say?
More individual contact than institutional contact, it seems, too.
Yeah, more individual as well. So for example, for the Iraqi Film Festival, I received over 80 submissions from filmmakers in Iraq alone. And that was just through word of mouth. I think because I have such a massive network of people, like everyone, like things just get around, I think. And I do open calls as well. And I always love talking with emerging filmmakers, especially. So yeah, I just kind of, yeah, it is through people, it's just through word of mouth, I think, and through those personal connections. And I still run Habibi Collective by myself, although with SHASHA, I do have a programming team now. So they're very great at also helping me find things. But there's so much to find, you know, there's a crazy amount of footage out there.
Thank you. I have a lot of private chats that I kind of wanted to go through with really great questions, but there's also a public chat question that which you should get to before it gets lost in the you know, in the stream here from Nesreen Milodi, who's saying, thank you very much. Would love to hear you talking some more about the need for grounding, that need for grounding as an Arab woman filmmaker.
Well, I mean, I'm not a filmmaker, so I don't know kind of how you would ground yourself as a filmmaker, but I always grounded myself in this sort of material culture rather than a geographic location. Because I think, like many of us from the region, you know, it's always displacement or you know, we have to immigrate, or we have to we're kind of everywhere, and in the diasporas, like I'm obviously in the diaspora, so it's more for me like that grounding has come in this material culture of film, of literature, especially even of music, and I think that those cultural ecospheres are such a grounding point. And I think they have expanded to include people, because obviously now we have social media in its absolute, you know, kind of crazy, crazy network, and we're all joined. So I think this sort of grounding can come through joining with your community and joining with your space. And I always find like Habibi Collective, like people really interact with each other in the comments section. Even in real life, back when we could all do film screenings, people would every screening, no matter where it was in the world, was always sold out, and it was always full of like young diasporic women who kind of found their own experiences reflected in those of the people sitting next to them. So I think there is great value also in grounding ourselves in shared experiences, which I think, yeah, the internet has made quite easy to do. Hopefully that answers your question.
I have a couple of more questions that are all actually really revolving around the kind of previous discussion about the materiality and immateriality of the archive, or the kind of push-pull of visibility and invisibility. And so I'll go first to Emily Fender's question in the chat, who's interested in ideas of invisibility or visibility, or the retreat from visibility, in reference to hito-sterile in relation to archival studies in general, or even just to Habibi Collective specifically in your own practices, or your other studies in surveillance. I'm wondering if you can just think through with us questions of visibility as they relate to the archive, on the one hand, or even a resistance to being made visible, let's say. And then on the other hand, we have another question.
Can I deal with that one first?
Yes,
Before...
that's great.
Sorry. Actually, yeah, Hito Stira wrote that, I can't remember the name of it, but that really amazing essay on like how through, what is it? Through like a proliferation of images, we're actually retreating into like invisibility, and we're like actively trying to become invisible. And we're hiding behind stock images. She definitely did write that. I can't remember the exact reference point, but I don't actually feel like we've reached that point yet. I think we're really just trying to get films seen now in the region. I don't think we've got to the point where we're like oversaturated. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing of like, that's how my career started as a programmer, just because of the invisibility of these films. And there's actually, sorry, I'm just going in the chat because I think, yeah, the spam of the earth. Yeah, that was it. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, these films are not available to watch, and they are invisible. And I think like Yeah, it's all in everything's is really inaccessible, and then it's almost like once we do have our hands on these films, we sort of like present them in these very closed ways, which is why I think the potential of a streaming service, for example, is kind of a way to combat that, um, and a way to make what is unseen not only seen but accessible. And access needs are obviously at the kind of pinnacle of what this kind of cultural artwork especially is trying to achieve right now, and in our times of COVID and pandemic. Yeah, like I don't know if there's any instance in relation to Arab women's essay film where we have become hyper visible, because even the fact of of telling these kind of political histories, through especially contemporary essay film that I touched upon, Mary Germana Saba and all these people, like they're trying to make these histories visible, and I can't really think of an instance where we're too visible. Yeah, I really don't think there's, if anyone else, thinks it, but I don't think I can't think of an example where I feel like I've seen enough Arab women's film now, or I've seen enough films by this nationality in the region, or this, I think there's just too much. There's too much that hasn't been seen. There's too much work to do, for it to feel like there's some sort of that there is any sort of oversaturation or any sort of overvisibility, or the need to retreat. I think I feel like retreating is the kind of last thing we should be doing right now.
And maybe we can actually shift this to this outcome, another strain of the thoughts that are going on in the private chats, at least, which is really about the reception of your work with Habibi Collective in particular, and the way that, do you have an experience with people, I'm reading now from the chat, of pigeonholing the work or reading it as a statement on diversity only? How are you navigating, let's say, the public perception or reception of the kinds of questions that you're interested in that might not actually completely map onto your own this kind of self-description of the project?
Yeah, well, obviously the region is so incredibly diverse. Even our kind of the academic discussions around, not even we don't really use the term Middle East, North Africa anymore. It does tend to be like Southwest Asia, SWANA, Southwest Asia, North Africa, and sort of around just reassessing kind of our own cultural borders. Also in terms of identity, like I'm Assyrian, I'm Iraqi Assyrian, but like I don't really kind of say I'm Assyrian, like, whereas obviously it's completely different with like Kurdish identity and like other sort of kind of more marginalized or oppressed identities that constitute the very broad Arab kind of word that we get, that we get contained in, but also that we use. And that's why I think the emergence of SWANA as a term is really interesting, because we are actually starting to have those discussions about how language should be reevaluated. As for diversity, I mean, I always get attacked by people because I'm not doing enough for one sort of person or one sort of, but I'm like, I can't speak for anyone. I can only speak for myself. And I think like I do make an extra effort to sort of, I guess, find films where like I said, where I feel like there's a kind of lack of circulation, or there are gaps, because I don't believe there's no films coming from those places. I believe that there's a lack of visibility for those films, which is kind of, again, the premise of the Iraqi Film Festival, or of the queer film festival that I directed. It's not like there's no queer films, there's no Iraqi films. It's the opposite. There's so many, but they're not visible. So yeah, and I guess the point of that is, well, being that programming is not natural. I think that a lot of people think the most famous films are the best ones, and like it's just because they have like the European distributor, the certified producer, the money, whatever, like a million reasons. So I think it's drawing attention to how, like I have to do that extra effort to find X, Y, and Z type of filmmaker to kind of platform. And again, that's a reason why I don't curate around national borders. I feel like, you know, people are always like, let's do a thing on Lebanese cinema, and it's like, well, you know, you never see a program on British cinema or American cinema, so why should we have one called Lebanese cinema, you know? And our borders are so precarious, and because of so many, like I said earlier, with the displacement, the diaspora, blah, blah, blah. So I think it is, you know, I think I kind of try and move beyond these representational politics sometimes and just curate around, that's a theme, like curating around theme is something that really is something I do a lot, which is again what I did for the Northwestern program. So around, yeah, like climate migration, like kind of social ecologies. There's a million different themes being approached by filmmakers in the region. Yeah, if that, I don't know if that taps into anything that you said.
I'd love to follow up actually with Anya Vega's question, which is to the whole of us, which shifts from the politics of representation of the individual filmmakers or the categories of filmmaking that you're dealing with, into the representational politics of the curatorial structure itself. You know, is there enough, you know, diversity, she's asking, in the archival process too? I mean, you mentioned as well that collection itself is a colonial enterprise. You know, so how do you also navigate the questions, the political question that's within the curatorial process itself, and not only in the history of the film, but also in the history of the archive?
Yeah, well, I mean, those are the questions I kind of asked at the end of the talk. I was like, how can we, how can we hold on to what is ours, let alone preserve it? How can we stop putting the writing of this history into the hands of oppressors, blah, blah, blah. Like, I think there is really an urgency to sort of develop an institution around archiving in our region, just because we want to see these films. People want, like, I wouldn't get asked a million times a day, where can I watch this, if people didn't want to see this film and these films. But I think I just think there's not a lot of education, I guess, around the kind of need for archiving and for programming. I never knew what an archiver programmer was, you know, before I kind of fell into it. And I think, like, in terms of how, yeah, it does need to be more diverse, but first we need to actually develop a sort of institution for us, by us, a sort of vocabulary, a methodology around archiving for those specifically within our region. As for, like, the sort of in relation to programming as something that already is very much, unlike the archive, very much flourishing, I think there does definitely need to be more diversity. Even here in London, I've stopped working with any sort of white institution, or, you know, like, kind of, because I felt like a lot of the time the presence of these programs was sort of on the sort of presence of these programs at places like, you know, places that reach out to me, like the Tate or whatever, these kind of big conglomerates, that, like, the films were used for commodifying purposes, to sort of tick these diversity boxes that would give that institution more funding that, you know, we should have been getting. And I think that stems from something I'm not going to go into too much depth around now, but the sort of agenda of representational politics over politics of production in these institutions. So they're willing to sort of showcase I don't know, Egyptian artist or a Black artist or whatever, without actually reflecting this in their boards and their staff, or the support that they actually give to the artists. So even in programming, which is something that very much exists, you know, we don't have that diversity. So I think we should start with archiving, actually start trying to build an institution first, and then, you know, we can recognize the problems with it.
Thank you so much. I have two questions, or quite substantive questions, that are kind of emerging from that train of thought here, and one is from Jesús Muñoz, who's a grad student here. It's asking, what are the sort of political, epistemological, ontological projects that your archival work is directed towards? And is it focused on that formalizing these conversations in Swana or Muslim American subjectivity, or something else that someone might, that as Sayed would call Muslimistan, kind of a vision of Ummah that includes diasporic subjectivities inside and outside Muslim Arab nations? And so if you want clarification, we can ask Jesus if he wants to talk further about this, but for me, I'm thinking about this as being kind of broader, sort of, are these broader conversations that are formalizing Swana or Muslim Arab subjectivity, or something else that might focus more on the diasporic? Is that, I'm seeing a nodding head in Jesus's box. So,
so wait, I'd actually like to hear, yeah, what you think, Jesus, about, because I don't quite understand yet what you are asking or what you're kind of.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I guess so far, from the information that I've been uptaking from your wonderful discussion and presentation, is focused a lot on revisionist historiography, reclamation, right? Sort of sets of individual experiences that create bonds and relationships, and sort of kind of sites of grounding for subjectivity or realization or transformation on an individual level. And I think that that's fantastic work, but I'm also curious if you have a sort of affiliation or direction towards maybe more broader reaching questions of politics or epistemology or ontology, right, that sort of shape the meaning or direction of your archival work to respond to global colonial systems of power, which, as you've said, also have a direct influence on the production of these very same artworks and films. And so if there is no, so far I haven't heard that sort of articulation to these sort of political, epistemological, or ontological like goals or projects. And I guess the follow-up question was, like, if there is no strong commitment that you're like articulating in terms of these larger projects, how would you respond to questions of efficacy regarding the impact the work in these archives can have on those same global colonial systems of power that also shape the very experiences that Arab women filmmakers are trying to represent, experience, or respond to in these same films?
That's an amazing set of questions and point of discussion. I don't even really know where to start. So I think, I mean, starting from my own subject position, which is kind of where I can speak from, is that I think a lot of the people who actually, maybe not the right word to use, but consume Habibi Collective are not necessarily film buffs or people interested in film and cinema. It's more people who are seeing their identity represented through this platform. And as much as I like to say, like, for me, it is just a kind of resource for my film research, but I think a lot of people have kind of taken it beyond that, and that's not in my hands. I feel like people have kind of taken this into their own it's in the public sphere. I mean, the platform operates very much in the kind of Habermas sense of the public sphere, and I think it's like, it's something that was not on the agenda for me, but I think it does definitely have a sort of, it does, I guess, inherently challenge especially discourses around feminism in the region and female identity and what that even means, it being a platform for women identifying folk. So I guess, yeah, I guess there is an engagement with definitely with politics there. Also in my work, just trying to draw attention to how a lot of these films, I think Trinity Minha, she said this, to paraphrase this kind of quote, which stuck with me for a long time, which is, don't make films about politics, make films politically. And I think that's something inherent for women making films in the region, because a lot of the time these films aren't about politics. They're just by, you know, inherently political, them being films made by Arab women. So an example of this, not to name any names, but like I was showing the online premiere of a film about mermaids, and it was geo-blocked from one country because the distributor, basically those two where the film was being distributed and the country they blocked, there was political kind of problems between this. There's lots of interregional politics, even beyond institutional bureaucracy. There's so many interregional politics in the region that actually dictates, you know, the films that we see and the films that are circulated. And it was a film about mermaids, you know, I mean, it was an analogy for something bigger, but it was a film about mermaids. And I feel like a lot of filmmakers come to me saying that they can get their films easily seen in the West. It's no there's this one Lebanese American filmmaker, and she sent her narrative feature length, and it's doing great on Amazon in the US, like really great on Amazon Prime, but she can't get it shown in Lebanon. And that's the case of many films. And yeah, it's nothing to do with really the content. It's just like the kind of politics of filmmaking and the politics of distribution, circulation, platforming, which is where my work is located. I also think it's super important to engage politically with what's happening. And I think curating thematically is a great way to do that. So, you know, like, especially with the streaming service, I'm going to curate kind of 20 or so kind of really carefully selected films per month in a sort of theme each month. And I think like that is a way for me to sort of, if something is happening that something's always happening, but if you know there's something kind of political that's really urgent in the region, to sort of develop a film like the next month to sort of be around this point of discussion, and using film as a way to instigate political discussion, which a lot of the time can actually happen explicitly. I think that's why sci-fi is really huge for women filmmakers in the region, especially with like filmmakers like Larissa Sansour being Palestinian. Women use sci-fi as like the analogy, you know, the sort of represent using film what they couldn't actually you can actually talk about. And also kind of responding to the politics of the wider community. You know, we're not isolated in the filmmaking community, you know, there's so much going on beyond that through, like, I think charity work is super important, and like raising money. And I did a Sudanese experimental film festival in Sweden in response to raising money for the Sudan Doctors Fund in relation to the revolution still ongoing. And also the recent Beirut explosion, a sort of live 24-hour artist live stream with 42 friends involved, and I mean loads of other examples. But I think, you know, it's not like we can't isolate ourselves politically as well. We can't just be talking about these issues without actually engaging with them. So now that I've said all this, I realize actually how political an enterprise it is. And I think I've spoken enough. I'm not going to go into the ontological or the epistemological, but yeah, I guess in terms of like epistemology and even the semantics of the words we're using, which I kind of touched upon before, like us using swan and now, and us not even having really a vocabulary to talk about ourselves, because we're still using a vocabulary that the West has put onto us, such as the word Arab. Actually, right here, I can see a question about translation, and that kind of ties into this, because I mainly have Habibi Collective in English. And I think that's just because, like, it is really the kind of middle ground, because I feel like I could do it in Arabic, but then, you know, that really kind of marginalizes everyone else in the Swana region, you know, because there are, you know, there's like countless ethnicities, and even like I said earlier, with kind of to bring my own identity into this, being like Iraqi, but being Assyrian, and like that sort of like a lot of people who are in Arab-speaking countries aren't kind of speaking Arabic because that's their kind of identity. It's because they're kind of forced whatever to. And also, yeah, of the dialects as well. Like with the Iraqi Film Festival, we put everything in Iraqi first, so all the kind of everything was in Iraqi and then was in English, and also we had in Kurdish as well. And actually with the streaming service, we are going to have lots of languages. But yeah, with Habibi, it is just in English because, you know, like I can't please everyone. There's always some angry teenagers kind of in my comments, and that's fine, because, you know, it opens up this discussion about how we don't have even the languages and the words to talk about ourselves. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your great question.
Thank you for that question, Jesus. We're nearing the end of our time, but there's one more question in the private chat about circulation and audience too. I think it ties in with this question of translation. If anyone has a last question they want to get in while we're discussing this one, please do. But it's about the audience that you imagine for the platform and the audience that is engaging with the platform, and how those two things might be interrelated or not. And so, is it by and for the diaspora? Is it by, right? Or what is the role, I suppose, of the audience in even shaping how the platform has developed in your own mind?
The thing that I'm most proud about Habibi Collective is that it, to this day, is consumed primarily by the people it's made for, which is young women from the region. That's, and even with things like the Iraqi Film Festival, our #1 viewers were, and engagement online as well, were people within Iraq. With the Queer Film Festival, it was kind of, queer people in the region. And I think, and that also just comes with having experience as a curator, which is all about kind of creating a space. Sorry, I'm distracted by the other chat question, which is kind of about, I guess, creating a space for kind of discussions to take place. And like I said earlier, not kind of closing it off as this is the exhibition. It is about like, how can this artwork operate in this site? And something that a lot of, especially when I was working with these earlier kind of white institutions earlier in my career, they would always say at the events, it'd be like, it's so nice, we don't usually have people like this coming into our gallery. And I was always like, no shit, decolonize your programs. But like, I think that does have to do with a sort of like mobilizing of a community through open-ended discussion, and that bears similarity to programming and archival practices by working to mobilize an industry. Because again, to use the example of Iraq, there are 80 films, but there's no industry, which is crazy. And I think because that comes with the way that the kind of institutional infrastructure of, for example, of film festivals. So I sort of wanted a radical pedagogy of this, in that I did loads of things. I waived entry fee and actually offered screening fees for the filmmakers, waived the need for a producer or even a distributor. I waived the competition element, because if you're trying to mobilize a community, like, I still don't understand why film festivals have, I mean, these have competition, and I also made it free online. And these are things I've kind of talked about in other instances. But yeah, and I just think that, like, it's to do with community building. I think it's just like, really engaging with your own community, and not using yourself as sort of representative of that community, because you're never going to be that. And even if you have like 50 people on your team, you're still not going to be representative of that. So it's actually just like listening to what people want. And I think that's where a lot of galleries get it wrong, because in London especially, there's sort of like a big panic right now, and they're like, oh, how can we like engage like kind of non-middle class white London people, and something that galleries do is that they always like put on like a printmaking workshop and then invite their target group, rather than ever actually asking this group, hey, what do you want? Like, what do you want to see? What do you want to do? And then facilitating that for them. Like, it's always one-sided. So it really comes from discussion, discourse, open-endedness, community, blah, blah, blah. And like, yeah, that, I think that's at the heart of engagement for me. And I'm also aware that, like, you know, I'm in the diaspora. I wouldn't be able to do I wouldn't be able to do what I do if I wasn't in the diaspora. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to do this work if I didn't have the protection of, I guess, of being in the diaspora. So I'm very, 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 very aware of my own privilege as well. But that doesn't exempt me from, you know, from that distance doesn't exempt me from that physical distance doesn't exempt me from actually like engaging very closely with all of the people that I'm working with, and and really engaging with the knowledge bases and the politics of wherever I'm sort of operating at that time in the region.
Thank you for this. I'm reminded that we're kind of ending the conversation with this kind of open-endedness with which you opened the conversation in your meditation on openings, you know, and beginnings, and how that itself kind of creates a structure, right? And that hesitation and how to create a structure for a thing that you want to be open, right? And so I just really appreciate your talking with us here, and for your highlighting the way that institutional change and epistemic change need to work together, and need to be, that are both kind of urgent projects that are not separable. And so I really appreciate that. And I think that we all need to be thinking through the ramifications of what Roisin said about that. And I thought that I would end with just giving you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about this kind of the couple of programs that are coming up, describe them before we go, and maybe, because there's so many questions about SHASHA and submissions as well that are coming in, both the private and the public chat, if you could just say a little bit about that before we completely wrap up.
Thank you so much for everyone for listening, and for just like listening to me like ramble. But yeah, so with SHASHA, there's loads of different projects going on, but SHASHA is probably the main one. It's so nice to be working with a team. And the team, it's all women identifying folk from in and around the region and the diasporas. And it will launch inshallah in February, although building a streaming service is a very big ordeal, which I didn't kind of anticipate at the beginning tech-wise. But yeah, it's going to be sort of like I mentioned, 20 very carefully selected films from the region. And as regard for submissions, I am always so open to people sending me films. I'm always a bit overwhelmed, so I might not reply straight away. And like, I appreciate when people annoy me and like follow up. But yeah, my email is like pretty much everywhere. I'm very accessible and contactable. So yeah, please always just like, if you want to submit, you know, it's, yeah, I'm sure your film will fit into any, you know, if you are, you know, a woman from the region, especially whoever, like, you'll be engaging with those discourses, and your film, I'm sure, will fit into a strand of discussion that we will explore at some point in the service. So yeah, I'm open to meeting more of you on a virtual, personal level. Yeah, thank you so much everyone for listening, and thank you again Rebecca and Danny and everyone for giving me this space. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Roisin. Thank you so much. we really so appreciate you coming and discussing with us. And I see that Malia has put in the chat links to your short programs that are coming up this week. But we loved hearing you and talking with you. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.